Okay, Mr. Robert Barnes, we have a bombshell for everyone watching right now. We are going to sue the Federal Reserve. And this, I know, for most people is kind of a crazy idea. And the way it came about was you and I were having dinner at my favorite place, or one of my favorite places in Vegas, at Cut there at the Palazzo steak joint. And we had just such an awesome conversation the whole night. But I kind of just randomly said, what if we sued the Federal Reserve? And what was on my mind is all of the shenanigans from March of 2020 when they just blatantly went around the Federal Reserve Act and even the spirit of the Federal Reserve Act. And I just noticed that nobody on CNBC or Bloomberg, no one even cared. They didn't even mention that they were breaking the law. And you and I have had so many conversations about how our country is becoming a country of men and not of law, and how that's such a big problem. So that's why I just kind of threw it out there and said, is this even possible? And you said, well, yeah, it is. And that conversation is kind of what brought us to where we are today. So just to give the viewer a quick summary, we're going to sue the Federal Reserve under the FOIA Act. And I'm going to put up the first chunk of change here. And we're going to set up a GoFundMe. And what we're going to do is for every dollar that people put into the GoFundMe to help this project and to help us with this campaign to, we'll call it hashtag end the Fed, or at least audit the Fed for right now, kind of taking something, big hat tip to Ron Paul there, of course. But for every dollar people put into the campaign, I'm going to match it. So if people put in $50,000, I'm going to put in $50,000 of my own, in addition to the probably $25,000 that I put in initially to get this thing going. So from a legal standpoint, kind of what's your strategy, and give us the legal jargon as to kind of how you're going to attack this.
Well, basically, the Federal Reserve has put Bernie Madoff to shame at their ability to keep their books from being audited and examined. But the Freedom of Information Act was passed to apply to all government agencies, including those that are interagency, the various boards of reserves, various board of governors of the various Federal Reserve subsidiary bank and member banks that have tried to evade the FOIA by saying that they're just private entities. Basically a range of cases going back to 2010 established that the Federal Reserve and its various member banks are subject to the Freedom of Information Act and have to disclose and disgorge information that's requested pursuant to the law. And you just have to know how to ask for it, where to ask for it, what detail to put in there. And we have the combined banking, financial, political, and legal information that can make the requests the most impactful and force them to disgorge that information. And if they don't, we will litigate it in court. And they may take the position that they don't have any legal authorization to do certain activities, and they have previously used that as their pretext to not turn over information. But we can then use that admission to show that they're actually engaged in illegal activities. That if they didn't have statutory authorization to do what they're doing, and that's their pretext for not turning over documents, that means they had no business doing it in the first place. And that will lead to the second stage of litigation of those people that have been injured or impaired by the Fed's illicit activities, subjecting them to suit, because in addition, them admitting that they don't have statutory authorization or claiming they're not a government entity also removes their sovereign immunity from suit. So either way, it's a catch-22 for the Fed. The Fed puts ordinary people and businesses in catch-22s every day. It's time to put the catch-22 back on them.
Yeah, very well said. And the point here is through the FOIA Act, we want to go in there and get all of these documents that will show what the Fed actually did, not just during 2020 and what they're doing today, but taking it back even further and trying to get more information than I believe Ron Paul was able to get back I believe it was, what was that, 2012 or so? I'm sure you'll know right off the top of your head, but just taking it to the next level. And then that's kind of stage one. And then once we get that information, then we can determine what they did, what they didn't do, and compare that to the Federal Reserve Act. And then we can determine what line they crossed in the sand and then kind of go from there. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's exactly right. Either we get the information that implicates them in illicit activities because they've crossed the line, or we get the admissions from them that are implicit admissions that they crossed the line by not turning over the documents in the name of it not being a statutorily authorized activity or them not acting in a sovereign capacity when they were doing so. That's why it's a win-win. Either we get the intel and information we can then use against them, or we get the admissions that we can then use against them. But either way, it forces the Fed into the catch-22 that enables us to take a second level of action after that.
Yeah. And I think what we'll do, because I want to make this quick summary, a quick summary, but what I'll do is I'll add another video to this web page that explains why I think we need to have laws that not only the average Joe and Jane have to abide by, but the politicians, the government, and especially the Federal Reserve. And why I think it's so important to put a lid on their power because of the inflation they've created since 1913 and how detrimental that has been to society at large, and how they're currently in the process of creating this constant boom and bust cycle that's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and really hollowing out the fundamental structure of our economy. And at some point, someone or some group of people, the people hopefully that will support this campaign, the rebel capitalists out there, will put an end to the destruction that they have created, whether they've done it intentionally or unintentionally. The society at large doesn't care. The damage has been done, and we've got to put an end to it.
No doubt. I mean, basically, the great utility of this suit, aside from fighting back by all legal means necessary, is that banksters often forget the rules of Earl Long, which was never in writing and always in cash. These guys put everything in writing, and they're never dealing in cash, not real cash. And so consequently, that affords an opportunity for us to discover and uncover their wrongdoings, expose it to the world, and then take second legal and political action consequent thereto. And it's the only legal means we have to try to fix this train before it fully goes off the rails.
Very, very well said. Thank you for your time. That's the quick summary, guys. And I'll probably do another video on this website explaining it further. Thank you for your time. And if you guys would like to support this campaign, we'll put a link to the GoFundMe page right here below this video. Thanks a lot, guys. Let me go through why I think this is so important, other than the fact that they have just blatantly broke the law. And we need to send a message to all the central planners that they are not above they're not above the law, and that there are things that constrain what they can do, and that we understand that these constraints are there to protect us from them, and that we are going to push back. We're not going to just turn and look the other way just because they tell us that what they're doing is beneficial. We're just not going to take it anymore. So that's obviously why the main reason we're doing this. But let's go into the nitty gritty. So I'm going to screen share, and I'm sure this is a chart that all of you have seen, but I really want to analyze it a little further. So this is the purchasing power of $1. Going back to when the Federal Reserve was set up in 1913. So you can see we start off the dollar being worth $1, or having $1, being able to buy $1 worth of stuff. And then where we are today, we're at what, maybe 3 cents. So today's dollar can buy what 2 or 3 cents could have bought you in 1913 when the Fed was established. So why is that important? Because wages almost always lag slightly behind the rate of consumer price inflation. Now, they do go up over time, that is true, but they're always going to, there's usually a slight lag. And your savings is definitely going to lag behind inflation, especially when the Federal Reserve themselves are artificially lowering interest rates and trying to create negative real rates, meaning the nominal interest rate is below the rate of inflation. That's when savers lose purchasing power. So if savers are, let's think through the incentives that the Fed has set up just at surface level here. What it does is it forces, it takes people from being prudent and saving money for the future, and it turns them into gamblers at a casino, to where they have to go into the stock market. They have to have a 401k that's constantly invested. They have to dollar cost average into a stock market that's at all-time highs and in a massive bubble. They have to invest in a bond market that's in one of the largest bubbles in human history. They have to speculate even in Bitcoin. They have to speculate in gold. They don't have a choice. They have to lever up and speculate in the real estate market. If they don't, and they might not consciously think this through, but subconsciously, they know that they will never, ever get ahead if they just produce more than they consume and save the rest. Why? Because the Fed isn't allowing them to do so. It's pushing them further and further out the risk curve. Additionally, it's destroying the poor and middle class. Not just the Fed, I'm not saying they're doing this intentionally, but inflation itself. And I don't care whether it's 2%, because, oh, it's just 2%. People who say, oh, it's just 2%, don't understand compounding effects. Because 2% compounded over 20, 30, 40 years, the amount of time in which you are most likely going to be working is a big, big number. And the Fed is outwardly telling us that they want to decrease your purchasing power every single year by a minimum of 2%. They're basically telling you that, hey, we don't want you to save money. We want you to do the opposite of that. We want you to be imprudent. We want you to go out there and speculate. We want you to gamble. We want you to consume more than you produce. We want you to take on debt. This is the type of behavior that they are incentivizing. So it's obvious why that is detrimental to the poor and middle class, but it gets far, far, far worse. And most people are never even cognizant of this. Let's go back to when we had, let's call it deflationary money. The Bitcoiners always like to talk about this, and rightfully so. Going back to the 1800s, from the year 1800 to the year 1900, the consumer goods, the price of consumer goods went down by 50%, meaning the value of dollars, the value of savings went up over 100 years. I mean, it's staggering to think about that in what we're living through today. Now, a lot of people say, oh my gosh, that would be a disaster because we can't have deflation. Oh, the economy would come collapsing in on itself. And they're right, it would. But because we've built an economy on debt. If we built an economy on productivity, then deflation, which is natural in a free market, would benefit not just the rich, but even more so the poor and middle class. Let's go through some numbers. If you look at the late 1800s, and I've done the math on this for a few videos, so I'll try to go through it right off the top of my head. We had about 2 to 3% deflation per year. Okay, the prices of goods and services got 2 to 3% cheaper. While at the same time, nominal wages increased. I believe it was maybe by 1% or so. Nominal wages, not adjusted for inflation. And that was per capita. While at the same time, nominal GDP went up. All right. So let's think this through. You're a McDonald's worker. You're making, and let's just use today's dollars so we can, it's easier to think through. You're making $1,500 a month. And let's say at the end of the month, you have nothing left. Your expenses are $1,500. Okay. Well, after, I can't remember the exact number I used in my video where I did the math, but it was roughly 20 years. Let's say you're working at McDonald's, the same job. You haven't gotten a raise. You haven't, well, you've gotten the raises, we'll say at the rate that everyone's wages were going up. So let's say 1% per year, right? But you're still doing the exact same job. You have no more responsibility. You're not a manager. You're not a regional manager. You've still got the exact same gig 20 years later. Working the same hours. Okay. 20 years later, you'd be making about $1,800 per month. And you say, well, George, that's not a big deal. That's only about a $300 difference. Right. But what happened to your expenses? That's the key. Your expenses go down to about $800. See, so your expenses go down, I call it 800. Your income goes up by 200 or 300. So now, instead of at a break even, you're putting $1,000 a month in your back pocket. And oh, by the way, the $1,000 in 20 years that you're putting in your back pocket every month can buy more goods and services than it did 20 years prior at the beginning. And if you would have taken your savings, put it in the bank, you'd be making about a 7% real rate of return annually. Why would you need to go into the stock market? Why would you need to go into the latest SPAC? Why would you need to go so far out the risk curve when you could just make 7% by simply putting your money in the bank? Think about how that would change the mentality of our society. Think about how that would change the incentive structure. And then think what that would do over time to the purchasing power of the poor and middle class. That's what we had when the Fed was not in the equation. You see why I'm always so hard on the Fed? And a lot of people like to talk about the wealth gap and this and that, but they missed the forest for the trees. You're talking about a symptom. Let's go to the root cause. The root cause is the Fed. And let's not even talk about wars. Could we go, and I understand that all these other countries have central banks, so we'd be at a huge disadvantage. But outside of that, let's just think through central banks. What do central banks do? They facilitate war. A country couldn't go to war unless they had a central bank. The only way they could is if they taxed the people to pay for the war. And how many wars would we be involved with if every time the United States went into another war, they had to increase the taxes on the middle class? We'd be in a hell of a lot fewer wars, I'll tell you that. So let's just set that aside for a moment. That's the first thing. Inflationary money, destroying the poor and middle class by taking away their purchasing power over time and forcing them into a life of basically playing a slot machine. They're playing financial Jenga. And at some point in time, the game of musical chairs stops, the whole thing crashes down, and who loses? Klaus and Bigglesworth and Yellen and Powell and Bernanke? Absolutely not. They come out smelling like roses. The people who end up losing are the poor and middle class. Okay, so I've made my point there. Number two, the second thing the Fed does to destroy our economy, and I would argue destroy society. Now, again, I'm not saying they're doing this intentionally. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. That's not what this is about. This is about putting up constraints on the central planners. So the second thing they do is they create a boom bust cycle. So they force everyone into speculative assets. And then they intentionally now, through artificially low interest rates and quantitative easing, they intentionally try to blow up asset bubbles. And then the average Joe and Jane are always the last ones to the party. Just like in 2008 or it's 2007 with the housing bubble. Same thing with .com. And what ends up happening? As soon as the average person piles in because of FOMO and greed, there are no more buyers, and the tulip mania is done. Comes crashing down, the whole house of cards. And who is there holding the bag? The average Joe and Jane. And the Fed exacerbates this problem. They may think that they're trying to smooth out the business cycle. They're not. The only thing they're doing is kicking the can down the road and creating a much bigger bust when it inevitably comes. That's the second thing. Now, so then the third thing that they do is completely distort the economy. They distort the economy and they create a misallocation of resources and an inconceivable amount of malinvestment. They through their policies, they completely hollow out the middle class, like we said, and the poor, and the manufacturing base of the United States, or a central bank of any country that pursues these types of policies. So that takes away all of the let's call them good job, not just the good jobs, but it takes away our ability to create goods and services. And you guys know from watching my videos, how do you measure the wealth of the society? It's simply by the amount of goods and services it can produce efficiently. It's not the amount of currency units that we can create. If that was true, then Venezuela would be would be the richest country on the planet Earth. So what it does is it builds an economy that is addicted to monetary heroin, just like heroin guy that I use in my whiteboard videos. And what happens is the drug addict needs more and more and more of the drug to have the same effect. The problem is the more of the monetary heroin the economy gets, just like the human heroin addict, the closer they get to their death. This is what the Federal Reserve is doing. And to exacerbate the unintended consequences of what they've done, now they are blatantly breaking the law in order to devalue the currency, in order to create a bigger boom and bust cycle, in order to turn our economy into a bigger monetary heroin addict, in order to hollow out our manufacturing base, and in order to destroy the middle class and the working poor. It's time for this to stop. Everyone that we listen to on YouTube, and that I'm just as big of a fan of as you are, they always talk about how the Fed is bad, the Fed is this, the Fed is this, and I do the exact same thing. I mean, for heaven's sakes, I wear a hat that says hashtag end the Fed, right? But we can sit here and bitch and moan about it all day long. But I truly believe as rebel capitalists, if you want to use that brand or whatever, we're not about just sitting on the couch and bitching about how bad the world is around us. We are about standing up and taking action, taking control over our destiny. And that's what this is all about. We need to take control so that the future, so that our families have a bright future, and that the central planners stop taking us down this path. It may be a path that's paved with good intentions, but you guys know exactly where the path paved with good intentions goes. So I just wanted to let you guys know kind of what we're doing. We're getting close to executing on this game plan, and I'll keep you posted. Obviously, we should have the page up on my website within the next couple days. The GoFundMe campaign, I've got Sebastian working on it, so that should be set up in the next couple days. And like I said, I'll fund it with the first $25,000 so that we can get Robert working on it. And let's see what we can do, and see what we can do as a community. I'm very optimistic, and at the very least, we can send a message that we're just not going to stand for this anymore.